Welcome to our one-on-one discussion with the major candidates to be the next mayor of Boston. My name is Jim Rooney, and I am the president and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber is the region's leading business voice, representing 1,300 businesses who collectively employ hundreds of thousands of people in and around Boston. Candidates are participating in many forums around the city, and in this conversation, we want to focus on the issues that are priorities for the business community of Boston and the big and small employers who drive economic success by creating and sustaining jobs. For many years now, Boston has enjoyed tremendous growth. The city attracts young talent, incubates life-changing innovations, and supports new development. We punch above our weight, so to speak, accounting for 2.2% of national GDP, even though we have just 1.5% of the national population. The next mayor has the challenge of growing and maintaining this success in a changed world. We've seen in the last year that a city's economic vibrancy and success is fragile, and across the US, both businesses and people are relocating. Oftentimes, relocations are driven by the costs of living and working, regulation, taxation, issues of public safety, and failures of local and state governments to meet the needs of its key industries and businesses. The risks are acute for Boston because we rely mightily on talent and employers that are mobile. In our next mayor, the business community seeks a partner who is willing to work side by side to compete in the global and mobile economy. Today's discussion is one way to learn about how candidates will do that. The candidates also completed a questionnaire we developed, and responses are posted on our website. The candidate field will be narrowed to 2 finalists in a citywide primary election on Tuesday, September 14th. The Chamber hopes all Bostonians will engage in this election by learning about the candidates and exercising their right and privilege to vote on election day. Our purpose at the Greater Boston Chamber is to make Boston the best place for all businesses and all people to succeed. So let's have a conversation about how we can do that together. I'm pleased to introduce candidate Michelle Wu. Michelle Wu is a mom, a daughter of immigrants, and a fierce believer that we can solve our deepest challenges through building community. As a Boston City Councilor, Michelle has worked in coalition to develop bold, systemic change and redefine what is possible through activist city leadership across our neighborhood. Michelle, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Jim. Great to see you as always.
Good to see you. There's a lot we'd like to cover, so we'll ask you to keep your answers succinct, but let's get started. First, why are you running for mayor?
You know, I'm someone who never imagined myself in politics or government growing up. I'm the daughter of immigrants. I have seen just how much government matters in people's lives. And it's really through my family's experiences that we have been at the mercy sometimes of our government structures. When I was in my early 20s, my mom began to struggle with pretty serious mental illness. And so I ended up becoming her caregiver and raising my 2 younger sisters through that period. This city of Boston has given me everything that I cherish in my life. I know how much is possible to come from the depths of struggle then to a place now where I get to live in a 2-family home in Rosendale with my husband and 2 boys upstairs, my mom downstairs, thanks to the incredible resources and opportunities here. So I've seen the challenges, and I also know just how much we can make a difference through city government. I'm running for mayor because I have a decade of experience in City Hall, knowing how to move and push the levers of power in partnership with community stakeholders in order to deliver a better pathway to opportunity for everyone across our neighborhoods. And so I'm excited that in this moment, we are facing tremendous uncertainty, but the next mayor of Boston, in partnership with our residents and our sectors across the city, has the opportunity to really dig down and address root causes and make sure that Boston is on a pathway for our continued success and shared prosperity for generations to come.
Thank you, Michelle. I want to shift to one of the biggest challenges facing the new mayor, and that's tackling equity and economic inclusion. Issues of racism, inequality, and the gaps in our society have appropriately been elevated in our public discourse. I know that government has a big role, but what's the business community's role in creating a more equitable Boston?
There's not a business leader I've spoken to or a leader at the helm of one of our large institutions who hasn't really reflected and taken the time over this last year and more of the pandemic and of our national reckoning on systemic racism to really push organizations to do more. And I think what we need in Boston is a vision driven by city government in partnership with all of our sectors and with business leaders to say, how are we not just doing our best in this moment, rising to meet the challenges and answering the call for racial justice and the deep changes that are needed, but that we're also planning ahead and looking to how we position Boston in this changing economy, in a world where the pandemic has deepened all of the racial disparities. How do we position Boston to be that city that is ahead of the curve? 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, how are we matching our workforce development pipelines with the jobs of tomorrow? How are we ensuring that we're prepared to jump into the green economy and lead the way and ensure that those opportunities are closing the racial wealth gap in Boston? How are we stabilizing our residents with addressing the housing crisis and transportation, which are putting a burden on residents as folks are getting pushed further and further out from job centers? So I look forward to a collaborative partnership with our business leaders because we all have resources to offer. We are all trying in our respective organizations to make change, to dig down and analyze the work that we're doing, the contracts that we're giving out, the hiring practices that we're putting into place. But when we can convene and be on the same page and work in concert according to an aligned vision, we can accomplish so much more. Boston will be way more than sorry, I guess sometimes I might get my English idioms confused. Boston will be, the sum of our parts will be greater than each one of us alone could put together.
Right. I want to move on to real estate development, which, as you know, is at times controversial, but also an important part of our growth. What's your view of the city's development review process, and does it need to be streamlined? And if so, what does that mean?
I came into government, as I mentioned, through frustrations dealing with government and on the family side. And one of the most foundational experiences that opened my eyes to how much government details matter was striking out and opening a small business as an entrepreneur and trying to do something that was going to help my family, my neighborhood, the larger community, but facing such red tape, such hoops to jump through, such complicated, and it felt at times arbitrary rules. And so I've come into government really understanding just how much of a barrier it creates when we have complicated processes that plenty of folks can still get through if you have the resources to navigate processes for a long time or hire expertise who can help facilitate that for you. And so if we really want to close the racial wealth gap, if we really want to ensure that we are building wealth locally in our neighborhoods, we have to simplify processes across the board. With development in particular, I've had an eye into this as chair of the City Council's Planning, Development, and Transportation Committee. And what I know is that when our zoning code dates back to a last comprehensive review in 1965, and when the disconnect between what that code says in so many cases and what is feasible economically and what matches our needs in terms of climate resiliency or affordability or transportation access or density, when that disconnect is there and we have to go through a parcel by parcel, case by case negotiation, we are spending such resources in the soft costs of that process, as opposed to being able to keep margins down and build more affordable units or ensure that we are matching what we need with neighborhoods. So what I proposed are changes to this development process that would get us to a predictable, clear, and consistent code. We need to have an understanding that when someone goes in and enters that process, there's a clear, predictable outcome. And it's not just putting you into a gauntlet for neighbors and for developers, not knowing what might emerge on the other side and building up so much cost in the meantime that should be going to delivering the types of changes and closing the gaps that we need in Boston.
Sticking with development, Michelle, the Seaport District's been criticized by all candidates and others. What do you think is wrong with the way the development unfolded in the Seaport? And what would you have done differently, or would you do differently going forward?
You know, we have a city funding source that is largely driven by our tax base, and within that largely driven by commercial development. And there's a push and pull in Boston of we need to ensure that we're continuing to grow in order to fund all of the services that are needed at the city level. And in some ways, the Seaport was successful in creating lots of jobs in the trades during that boom, in seeing tax revenues built up to fund city services and other amenities as new properties came online and have been contributing to that tax base. But when you think about who is represented of Boston's community, who feels comfortable in the Seaport, whose fortunes and wealth were represented in the growth of that district, we have fallen short in addressing our urgent needs for equity and for connectedness. This is a district where I point out that our housing goals have not been met in terms of wanting to ensure that there is a growing residential component to that neighborhood. We've fallen short of what the planned goals had been. Our transportation goals have not been met in that we've had a little reprieve during the pandemic, but we are headed right back there with traffic in a part of the city that we were proposing a gondola system to be able to fly people out of traffic, because that's how badly it had gotten in terms of the disconnect with available flow and access for public transportation. And it's also an area of the city that is extremely climate vulnerable, and where not too many years ago in the snowmageddon of winter, early 2018, we saw some critical infrastructure, T stations taken out for 8-9 months at a time because of the flooding, the waters that were pushed from buildings that were armed to deal with those floods, but not the infrastructure. And so we really need district planning, we need neighborhood planning, we need citywide planning. That is the crux of the changes that I hope to present in order to ensure that we are growing in a way that is compatible with our long-term sustainability and resiliency, and with the drive to ensure that Boston is representing the full diversity of our community in how we are growing and benefiting.
Let's talk about education, Michelle. The business community cares deeply about education because today's students are tomorrow's workforce. During the pandemic, the poor condition of schools in Boston was highlighted and is in need of significant capital investment. Before spending hundreds of millions of dollars in school infrastructure, do we have too many school buildings? As mayor, how would you address, for example, the results of the 2015 audit that revealed that BPS should consolidate some schools?
You know, this is a topic that's extremely personal for me. I am from a family, the oldest kid in an immigrant family, where public education and trying to make sure that my siblings and I were able to really connect with what my parents couldn't offer, the doors that would be open in this country, came through a fierce commitment to connecting us. And every time my dad's salary went up, the family would uproot and move to that next smallest house in the best possible public school district that my parents could afford. And it is what opened doors for me to be able to step into rooms that I never could have imagined growing up. I've also been involved in the Boston Public Schools now as a parent and legal guardian for a decade, first raising my sister in the midst of my mom's mental illness through middle school and high school, and now with my own 2 boys, both in BPS. When you go and you visit each one of our Boston Public Schools, you see the range of disparities that are there. It is unacceptable that some of our schools don't have doors on the bathroom stalls, or still have lead pipes connected to the drinking fountains, which aren't safe, much less reaching the level of inspiration and academic opportunities, science labs, performing arts spaces that all of our kids deserve. And so it is true, right? Boston's population has gone up and up and up, where the number of kids in our school district has gone down and down. We've seen more than 100,000 additional people added to Boston's population over the last decade, but the number of kids living in our city, much less enrolled in our schools, as a whole has decreased. There are a lot of factors here, and certainly the school system is one piece of it that we need to deliver quality through the facilities, through early education, through vocational training, through wraparound supports across every part of our district. But there's much more than that as to why families are getting pushed out of Boston. Housing costs and transportation access is a key piece of that. And so I want Boston to be the city that is known as the most family-friendly place in America. We know that there are families who want to enroll their students, their kids in Boston public schools, but often don't feel like the seats are in the right places, or they don't feel like they'll have the access to opportunity or resources that we all want for our little ones. We need to really dig in, put a Boston Public Schools mom in charge of our city, and transform what's possible through our school district. That is how we will get to see the real level of interest, of engagement, and the decisions that should be made. One other point on vacancy, sort of the facilities question relative to the number of students in Boston Public Schools. Some of the estimates we have seen have been based on pretty crowded classrooms. And we saw during the pandemic that when we had to all of a sudden ask for desks to be spaced 6 feet apart, our schools couldn't open. There was not enough space. We had to delay, and my son did kindergarten over Zoom because we were not able to think about other facilities. And within the footprint of BPS, there was not adequate space to allow for that kind of ventilation space because our classrooms had been crowded in many cases to begin with. The other point I want to make is that schools should be about much more than just our young people's math, science, and language arts curriculum. Schools should be a hub for the entire community. And so if there are public buildings that we use classrooms in for a certain portion of the day, could we co-locate childcare in some other spaces there? Could we co-locate vocational training for lifelong learning, keep buildings open at night? We need to do a lot more with this precious real estate that we have. Could we redevelop and integrate affordable housing into some of the footprint that we have through BPS and other city buildings? This is how we have to start thinking creatively, proactively, to really wrap around all of the needs that we have with the resources, the tremendous resources that the city of Boston has.
In my opening remarks, Michelle, I noted that some relocation occurs because of public safety. Movements to defund the police have swept across America. What does that phrase mean to you? And would you cut funding in the Boston Police Department budget in 2023 if elected?
We need deep changes to our police department and to our system of public safety in Boston. We have seen, unfortunately, time and again, our department in the news, whether it is for cases of misconduct that did not face accountability, or overtime fraud, or other incidents that certain by no means represent the entirety of our department, but show very important flags as to the depth of change that is needed across the structure and the culture of our department. I believe that we need to invest more in the ecosystem of public safety and public health. But when we talk about our departments in a very siloed way, that leads to a skewed conversation about what we're trying to achieve. Community advocates are absolutely right and have been saying for decades that we need more accountability. We need more connection and trust with community. We need to deliver the services that residents are actually seeking in those moments of crisis when they reach out. And we're not meeting those benchmarks, in my mind, adequately in this moment. To really reach and connect to our residents, we have to be investing in a public health-led approach to public safety. I know what it feels like to be standing with a family member, with my mom, in the depths of an episode of mental illness, and to have the police called, and to be standing in terror, worried about how that interaction might go with an armed officer there, to be begging for her to be sent to the hospital rather than the police station. And I've had conversations with many of our officers who also share concerns about whether we are meeting crisis response calls with the right types of training and services. In some precincts, the vast majority of 911 calls that come in are for situations where our officers are not best equipped to respond, whether it is mental illness, whether it is homelessness, substance use, and overdoses. So much of our resources are being drawn in this way when we should be responding with public health resources. Cities that have adopted this model have not only better served their residents, but have seen cost efficiencies because they're actually providing what's needed in that moment, freeing up policing resources to the places where we actually do need and are stretched thin. And so for me, there are a couple big pieces to the conversation about public safety and policing reform in particular. We need to focus on crisis response and having support for public health within that. The places where we are shifting away from armed law enforcement to a community de-escalation trained force that is right up there and building on this model. The second is we need to ensure that we're getting overtime costs under control. This is a line item that has been ballooning past the growth of other line items within the city budget. It is affecting the funding that is available for other very important community needs. And it is deeply tied to provisions within the police contract that need to be renegotiated. We also need to ensure accountability, again, tied to the contract. As of just about a month ago, we are more than a year with an expired bargaining agreement for the Boston Police. So the next mayor will have the very important tasks of choosing and appointing a new leader for the department to partner on these important reforms, as well as renegotiating a contract that needs to embed transparency, accountability, and community trust into how we move forward as a city.
Well, Michelle, our time has gone by way too quickly. What is your closing message to the business community of Boston? What can business leaders expect from a Wu administration?
I'm grateful for all of the leadership and all the civic engagement that I know so many of our business leaders wear various hats all throughout the year, and especially during the pandemic, to have seen how much everyone has stepped up, has showed just a glimpse at what is possible if we are all on the same page, aligned on a vision for Boston that believes in what we can accomplish, taps into our legacy as a city that has always stood up for the greater good, has always led the way. And as you said in your introduction, Jim, was always punched above our weight, right? That when we lead in Boston, we change the trajectory of history across this country. And so what I ask is for clear communication and partnership, for a focus on what is possible rather than just what has been. And I ask that everyone really digs down to believe in how we can work together for a city that sets the standard. We're in a moment of economic uncertainty all across the world, but cities in particular have to present a new value proposition in the reshuffle of what it means to live and work and commute, all done now with more access to technology. And so as we work to drive down the cost of living and to be that city where you can't miss out on being there in person, this is going to require collaboration, partnership, and a vision that has all of us at the table together.
Well, Councilor Michelle Wu, thank you for an interesting conversation and for your time today. That concludes this session. And thank you to all our listeners. And once again, I hope all of the people of Boston will participate in the upcoming primary election. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.